take any further time, as Mufti Isap was growing up in Frenchwood. He's grown up here, he's homegrown. There's no need for any introduction whatsoever. Hence Mufti Isap will be beginning his program immediately.
Come closer, inshallah. Come as close as you can. Let's fill in the gaps. We can. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم ما بعد. There's kind of two parts that I want to approach this. Sitting in the masjid, especially in the current talk that I'm going to give, it might not be the best example, but we'll do it. If you want to learn to use a weapon, you want to learn to fire a weapon, there's two things. You have to learn the theory and then you have to go into the firing range. So I'm going to give you the theory first, and we're going to do the theory for about 20 minutes. Very simple, very basic. I'm going to give you the theory. That's the ammunition. And then I'm going to take you through the process on the firing range, and I'm going to show you the myth-busting process. So there's a question that's asked, how I'm going to respond, how you're going to respond, how we're going to think about this. I'd be lying if I said this was all my work. This has been the culmination of a work of a number of people. Some people from London, Ustad Ahmed Jaddu, Sami Hamidi. I was on the phone with Ustad Ahmed Jaddu literally like 2 hours ago, and I was kind of getting some direction from him as well in this regard as well. So, it's a culmination of a lot of people's efforts and a lot of people's work. As always, I advise you to make notes. It's going to be useful to yourself. And so we'll begin with the theory. And the theory, it's usually boring, but I'm going to try and make it as clear as possible. I just want you to hang on to what I'm saying. So we've got to start with the history. And the history, that word, it's quite boring, but we're not going to go too far, and we're not going to go too far back, and we're not going to go too far into it. We're probably going to look at about 30, 40, 50 years. More than 100 years ago, World War I takes place. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire was allies with Germany. Ottoman Empire was this large expanse, it's this empire, and they were allies with Germany, and they were defeated. The Ottoman Empire was defeated. The empire was dismantled. And dismantled meaning the chunks were broken up into different countries, and the French and the British were on the other side. They took possession of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, other sections. Simple, nothing complex so far. 100 years ago, World War I takes place. Ottoman Empire, Germany are together. The dismantling takes place of the empire. The French and the British, they take possession of these pieces of land. In 1917, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, his name was Arthur Balfour, he writes a letter addressed to the main man of the British Jewish community. It's a very short letter, it's 67 words. And what the British Foreign Secretary commits, and I quote the exact words, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So in 1917, Arthur Balfour writes this letter, and it's going to the British, the main man of the Jewish community, and it says, we're going to give you a national home for the Jewish community in Palestine. That's known as the Balfour Declaration. Why was it controversial? Reason number one. In essence, the Balfour Declaration was made by an English foreigner who has no claim to Palestine, and it was made to a foreign Jew who has no right to that land either. The native Palestinians, who were the majority residents, had zero say in the matter. That's the first reason it was problematic. The second reason is the Balfour Declaration was one of three conflicting promises made by the British. Pay attention. In World War I, Britain had already promised the Arabs that we're going to give you an independent Arab state which includes Palestine, if you help us fight against the Ottoman Turks. A lot of people who know about the history of the Ottoman Empire, by the way, it's been about 100 years exactly since the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. It might be worth something to explore as a masjid, Ottoman Week or Ottoman Empire Week or something of that nature. But Britain promised the Arabs, listen, we're going up against the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims, but we need your support. And so the Arabs assisted Britain, France, the allies as they call them, against the Ottoman Empire. If you help us fight the Ottoman Turks, we'll give you Palestine. The Arabs, they're loving this. We've got Mecca, we've got Medina, we've got these central lands, and to get Palestine as well, the Infinity Stones. So they're buzzing, they're happy to go with that. That's a modern day, okay, fine, good. So Britain had already promised the Arabs that we'll give you an independent Arab state which includes Palestine. And that's known as the 1915 Hussein-McMahon correspondence. Hussein was on one side, McMahon was on the other side. You can guess who was on which side. As if two deals for the same piece of land wasn't enough. The British had made one deal to the Jews, they made another one to the Arabs, But they also promised the French in a separate treaty known as the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement that the majority of Palestine will be under international administration. But the rest of the region, the rest of the Arab states would be split between the two colonial powers. They will split it between England and France after the war. But Palestine would stay under international administration. So that was the third deal on the table. Britain, to get these allies in place, have put these different deals. You can only go ahead with one of these deals. Which deal ended up going ahead? The Balfour Declaration. And so this entire saga, this entire story begins in 1917. So that's the initiation of this kind of history lesson. That's the theory we're building. So you need to have this theory for when we're going to go on the firing range. Now let me ask you, why is the British government so eager to offer the Jewish community land? That's a question that we've got to realistically ask. And remember, my approach to this, I'm not interested in fueling wars between religions and Muslims and Jews and things like this. As an academic, my objective is to look at things from an academic perspective, to look at what details we have in front of us and to ask those academically kind of, tantalizing is the word everyone likes to use in academia, those questions that are going to bring us some answers. So what's the reason for the British government to offer the Jewish community land? Well, we think Europe has to offer us some lessons or some morals or some, a way of living. The entirety of Europe had such a hatred for Jews. Look across history, Jews were expelled from England, from Wales, from France, from Germany, from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy, from Hungary, from Austria, from Lithuania. Where did these Jews find safety? Where did they find their refuge? In Muslim lands. They moved to Al-Maghrib, they moved to Tunis, they moved to Egypt. The Ottoman Empire took them in. If anti-Semitism has been found anywhere, it was found in Europe. And so that's the first thing we need to understand. In the 1900s, the Jewish community populated two key areas. This is important to know. The Jewish community, there were those living in the East. East is looking at in and around Russia. And there were those in Europe. That's coming into Europe, these areas, right? You've got Germany across to the UK, etc., different places. Not so much in the UK, to be fair, in the 1900s. In the Eastern world, where you got Russia, pogroms were taking place. Pogroms is a fancy word where the Jewish community is being targeted, they're being persecuted, and so the Jews in the East were fleeing. Where were they going to flee to? Well, Europe's a good option. We've got the rest of our community there. And so the Jewish community are moving to Europe. So what happens? The British decide to look for a solution to the quote-unquote Jewish problem. That's not terminology that's used by the Muslim world. That's not terminology that we use. These are the Western values that we're enamored by today. So they say we need a solution. So what did they propose? In 1903, England proposed 6,000 square miles in Uganda for the Jews. It didn't even start with Palestine. In 1903, 16,000 square miles in Uganda for the Jewish community. That fell through. And England wanted to, quote unquote again, rid themselves of the Jewish refugees. And so they eventually decided on Palestine. And many of the rabbis of the Jewish community, they opposed the move to Palestine. The segment of Jews who pushed for the move to Palestine, they were known as Zionists. They firmly believed in a homeland for the Jews, and they were making every effort to establish it in Palestine. You need to understand, mainstream and Orthodox Jews, at that time they rejected this notion and they would mock Zionism and they would deem it as theological hearsay. Takfir basically, they would call them kafir from the Jewish tradition. So what happens next? Between 1923 and 1948. Now stay focused, we're on the second part. It's not so difficult if you pay attention. Between 1923 and 1948, the British facilitated mass Jewish immigration. Think about the dates. Around this time, most residents are fleeing Hitler and the Nazi movement towards England and other such countries. And the British government is looking for a way to expel the Jewish influx. And of course, just imagine, for the Palestinians, this is madness. The British are confiscating our lands and handing them over to Jewish settlers. So the British are directly involved between 1923 and 1948. During this time frame, in 1936, we're still in that time frame, 1923 to 1948, in 1936, escalating tensions eventually lead to the Arab Revolt. That lasted for 3 years, 1936 to 1939. What's this? Palestinians have had enough. So they launch a general strike for 6 months. They withhold tax payments, they boycott Jewish products to protest British colonialism and the growing Jewish immigration. Fair enough. But the strike was brutally repressed by the British. They launched a mass arrest campaign and carried out home demolitions, a practice that Israel continues to implement against Palestinians today. The second phase of the revolt began in the late 1937 and was led by the Palestinians, and it targeted British forces and colonialism. By the second half of 1939, Britain had amassed 30,000 troops in Palestine. I want you to think about this. Today we're talking about Afghan migrants. Afghan migrants coming into the UK and coming across the ships and all of these things. Ask yourself where a lot of these are coming from. Ask yourself about the foreign policy of Britain. Britain goes to Afghanistan. It obviously has people who are providing them information on the Taliban and things like this. And then when Britain decides to leave, who's going to provide the security to these people who are kind of providing information? So Britain actually writes an agreement and contractually that anybody who we supported or assisted, we will give them refugee status in the UK. Now that's happening because of foreign policy. And so again, a person not aware of foreign policy, a person not aware, why are there 30,000 troops in Palestine? And so villages were bombed by air, curfews imposed, homes demolished, administrative detentions, summary killings widespread. In those 3 years of revolt, 5,000 Palestinians were killed. 15,000 to 20,000 were wounded, 5,600 were imprisoned. The numbers just roll off the tongue. Now to talk about deaths in their thousands and tens of thousands, very easy. Think about the whole of Preston, how many people are in the whole of Preston? An entire village, an entire community, destroyed, non-existent. You didn't exist. Nobody cares. And so from 1920 to 1946, almost 400,000 Jewish immigrants, mostly from Europe, arrived in Palestine according to British records. Now, in the mid-1940s, the British government started panicking. They were worried about the eruption of violence between the Palestinians and Zionists. So they tried to curtail and slow down the immigration of European Jews. They said, look, guys, we're not going to keep sending people now, we're going to slow it down. Right? So the policies are changing in 1940s. 1944, a bunch of these Zionist armed groups, they declared war on Britain. The Zionist entity declares war on Britain. How dare you put limits on Jewish immigration to Palestine, especially at a time when we're fleeing the Holocaust? So the Zionist paramilitary organizations, these kind of military organizations, by the way, ironically trained by the British. Arms were provided by the British. They turn against the British. They launch a number of terrorist attacks against the British. And the most notable of which was the King David Hotel bombing in 1946, where the British administrative headquarters were housed. 91 people were killed in the attack. It seems like the tables have turned. And so now the Zionist entity is causing acts of terrorism against the British, who provided all of these things. Early 1947, the British government is now seriously panicking. And they announced that they're going to hand over the disaster it created in Palestine to the United Nations, ending its colonial project there. We've had our fun, we played our games, we've carved up some pieces of land, we've affected thousands of lives, but it's okay, the games are done now. We'll just, game over, reset, go somewhere else, try this again somewhere else, see if we can make something somewhere else. And so in 1940s, an absolute demonstration of incompetence from the British. 1947, pay attention to this now. In 1947, 33% of Palestine is now Jewish. 33% of Palestine is now Jewish, but the Jewish community only owns 6% of the land. So the UN turns up, the United Nations. Who are they? An organization who alleges to maintain international peace and uphold international law. They propose a partition of Palestine. This partition, they propose to randomly and arbitrarily carve up Palestinian land and hand it over to the Jews and produce Jewish states. How much did the Palestinians own? 94% of the land. How much were the Palestinians allotted after this? 42%. Imagine you have 94% of the land, 6% of it has already been taken, that's fine. We're now going to take a bit more of your land and we're going to take the majority of you and you're going to have 42% left. They gave the majority to the Jewish state, which was 55%. Even though Palestinians comprised of the majority population, those of you who are quick at maths, you'll have probably calculated 55% plus 42% does not equal 100%. There's 3% missing. That 3% was Jerusalem and it remained under international control. Because they knew if we hand this over to anybody, it's going to cause riots. So the Jews were handed a bunch of land that was encompassing many of the main cities, where the Palestinian Arabs were a majority. Not only that, the Jews were given the coastline from Haifa to Jaffa. This is important. You see, had the Palestinians been given 50-50, and you, remember, if I say to you, I'll give you 50-50, that's one thing. But 50-50 of what? For example, think about it like this. If somebody brings into your house, there's an Amazon delivery, and the Amazon delivery contains a cake. It's in a box, and that box is inside a parcel, and that parcel is inside this and that. And then there's the cake, and then there's all this. So the guy comes and he says, right, we're going to split it 50-50. You can keep the box. You can keep this. You can keep that. You can keep this. The cake, we're going to cut it a quarter, and you can keep a quarter. Because you got the box and all of the other stuff, right? It's not 50-50 really when you think about it. It also matters not just on the quantity, but the quality of the land. From the entire coastline was given to the Jewish community. The Arab state is deprived of key agricultural lands, seaports, all of these different things that are not taken into consideration, plus the majority is given to the Jewish community. That leads the Palestinians to reject this proposal. Of course they would. What happens next? The brutal Naqba of 1948. This is the last thing I'm going to discuss. Because I don't think we have to go further than the Naqba. I think if we just get this section right, we have enough ammunition for us to now discuss the getting into the the firing range and to kind of the shooting range and to actually now apply real life scenarios. What's the Naqba? Let's just talk about the Naqba and then we'll wrap this section up here. Naqba means the catastrophic event, which was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the destruction of the Palestinian homeland and society. So the Zionist movement says, well, Britain's no longer involved. They've armed us. They've given all of this military. We've got our little paramilitary groups. The UN has carved up this piece of land and they've said we're out of here. So we'll get what we want our way. By the first half of 1949, at least 750,000 Palestinians in total were forcibly expelled or fled outside of their homeland. Let me tell you, the only reason Israel has had some level of restraint right now is because it's documented live. It's being live streamed. If it wasn't for that, there would be no Gaza, there would be no West Bank, there would be nothing. And that's what was taking place in that time. 750,000 Palestinians were, by the first half of 1949, 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled or they were made to flee outside of their homeland, forced to leave their homes. As if that's not enough, the Zionist forces killed thousands of Palestinians. They massacred the Palestinians, attacks, bombings of homes, looting, destruction of property, entire villages. Palestinians didn't stand a chance. The British had armed and trained the Zionists to the teeth. Tragic incident. 520 villages, not homes, villages, communities, full communities, wiped out. 530 villages were destroyed. A massacre in various different places, Baldatul Sheikh, Al-Abbasiyya, Lida, Dar Yassin, all of these different places, over 15,000 killed. And this only got worse in 1967. Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem and other areas, and that's it. Now, there's a bit more, but I'm not going to go any further. I'm not going to go any further on those discussions. I'm done with the kind of historical side of things. Now I want to look at our kind of myth-busting session. And so, especially with this myth-busting stuff, you've got to pay attention to what's being said here. Now, a lot of the time when you're kind of in a conversation, and the reason we're going through the myth-busting, even though it's 2 years too late, but it's worth doing to kind of refine our thought processes. One of the kind of courses we have in the classes we have is Youth Essentials. And the Youth Essentials class, one of the things that we do is we have mock court cases. So I'll teach some material, we'll go through something, kind of women in Islam or something like this, we'll go through the module. And then we'll bring in external people as the jurors and I'll be the judge and we'll have a prosecution team. And the prosecution team will have a kind of a list of questions I've put together. And they will question these students. And the students have to give responses. It's not to create debaters or to create people who can argue. It's to allow them to think and develop that thought process of, okay, this is the argument. And you're seeing it happen in real time. And so when you're in these scenarios, the first advice that's always given is you've got to pay attention to what's being said. This is one of the hardest things, and you're going to see a lot of questions I'm going to propose. And by the way, some of the questions you guys sent in, some of the really difficult questions, was Hamas justified on the 7th of October, and these types of questions, I'm going to discuss them. But I'm going to explain to you why the question is fundamentally phrased wrong, and how we're approaching it wrong. And sometimes you have to question that. And so many arguments, they rely on vague generalizations, emotional appeal, selective information. You've got to listen carefully for those inconsistencies, those contradictions, right? You've got to listen to the subtle shifts in the topic. You've got to be aware of the techniques that are being used, emotional baiting, right? They'll ask you an innocent question, but they kind of, rage baiting, they're kind of hooking the bait and you're going to kind of fall for it. You've got to be calm when you respond, but you've got to respond confidently. You've got to challenge that poor logic. You can't let things go unchallenged. If somebody says something, you've got to challenge that question even. Right? Common tactics you'll come across, a straw man argument. Your position will be misrepresented. You'll say something and, oh, you mean this? No, you've straw manned my argument. Right? The red herring, someone will raise an unrelated issue just to derail the discussion. Something random, and that's it. False equivalence. False equivalence is where you kind of make both sides equal, where both sides are portrayed as equally powerful or equally responsible. And so you're going to identify these tactics. Now that comes with practice, that comes with training, that's not for everybody, but you have to develop that skill. Right? And then of course you've got to support your points with credible, verifiable sources. Right? This is something we all have to do. International bodies like the United Nations, even though I'm going to kind of I'm going to slew the United Nations and these kind of human rights organizations, and I'm going to kind of tell you that these are just, what's the best way to phrase it? We'll come on to it. But these are just, representations of democracy. Whereas, as Omar Suleiman puts it, the Palestine and Gaza is the graveyard of all these slogans, of all these freedom of speech and freedom of expression and all these ideas of human rights and all of these things. Your expressions, you can leave them. They're buried. They don't exist anymore. And so, but don't be afraid to ask the other person for evidence as well. You've got to stay focused, stay on topic, polite but assertive. Right, so and finally, don't stay on the defensive. If somebody asks you a question, respond and then push back on a question as well, right? What basic civil rights do Palestinians in the West Bank have under Israeli control? So let's take a look at some questions. Question number one, or myth number one: Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend itself. This is one of the most abused phrases in modern political discourse, right? The truth is clear in international law. Israel is not a victim defending itself. It's an occupying power. Under the 4th Geneva Convention, it has no legal right to invoke self-defense against the very people whose land it is colonizing and controlling. It's a very simple thing. If you look at the 4th Geneva Convention, there is an occupying power. Occupying means you are occupying their land. That's not yours, you're occupying it. That occupying power, it's doing something illegal. If the occupied uses military force against you, you cannot respond with the argument of self-defense. That is against international law. That in and of itself is illegal. That in and of itself is illegal. A lot of the time we kind of use the argument of, and when Piers Morgan had his moral quandary of, what should be their response? How should they respond? What should their defense be? International law makes it clear. Who is the occupying force and who is the occupied body? The occupying force has no right to even defend itself against the resistance of the occupied powers. It's as simple as that. This is an international law, and we're going to touch on that more. Gaza, despite the so-called disengagement in 2005, is still under total Israeli control. Its borders, its airspace, its sea access, its electricity, population registry, economy, all of this is dictated by Israel. That makes Gaza occupied territory, and Israel is the occupier. Articles 47 to 78 of the Geneva Conventions explicitly state that occupying powers are responsible for the protection and welfare of the occupied population. Instead, Israel has turned Gaza into a laboratory for military experimentation. Every few years it unleashes disproportionate, devastating force on a besieged civilian population. And me personally, I'm sick of hearing women and children, women and children. It's men, women and children. Just because somebody reaches the age of being a military, being part of the military, doesn't mean they're part of the military. The men in Palestine, the men in Gaza, the men in the West Bank, they're also civilians. What's this constant women and children? It's men, women and children. These are all civilians. And so you can't do all of this and then seek the world's sympathy. Claiming self-defense whilst you enforce checkpoints, build settlements, control borders, bomb refugee camps, starve an entire population, it's this perverse distortion of morality. It's not morality, it's not morals. It's the equivalent of a home invader shooting the home owner and then calling it self-defense when the guy pulls a knife out. It's as absurd as that. No state has the right to defend its theft. You don't have the right to defend your theft. You don't have the right to defend your apartheid. You don't have the right to defend these things. Meanwhile, Palestinians, the ones being bombed, caged, prisoned, dispossessed, executed, they told you have no right to resist, no right to self-defense, no right to even mourn publicly without being labeled as terrorists. It's a staggering hypocrisy. Israel, armed with the most advanced military hardware and backed by billions in US aid, bombs civilians in real time, along with British aid as well. Palestinians on the other right are denied even the right to exist. Let's be clear. The only party with a legal and moral right to resist is the occupied, not the occupier. UN resolutions, human rights law, and the basic principles of justice affirm this. The real question isn't whether Israel has the right to defend itself, it's how long the world will keep defending Israel's right to occupy, to oppress, and to kill. The next myth. Hamas is to blame for the destruction because they started this. This is historical gaslighting at its worst, a complete inversion of reality. To claim that Hamas started the violence on October 7th is like accusing a prisoner of starting a fight for lashing out after decades of torture. October 7th was not the beginning, it was the breaking point. Right? The inevitable consequence of over 100 years of Zionist colonization, mass displacement, military occupation. In 1948, let's talk the facts. In 1948, over 750,000 Palestinians are violently expelled from their homes. Entire villages wiped off the map. Since then, Israel enforces a system of land theft, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid. The West Bank is carved up by illegal settlements. Gaza, under Israeli siege since 2007, open-air prison, where over 2 million people, half of them children, live in unlivable conditions, denied freedom of movement, medical care, clean water and hope. By the way, I'm talking before 7th of October. If you look at the data, 97% of the water before the 7th of October wasn't safe for drinking. I'm not talking post 7th of October. I'm not talking about what we see on our screens. I'm talking about what it was before. And yet when Palestinians resist, when they finally say enough, the world suddenly clutches its pearls and says, why now? Israel has bombed Gaza relentlessly 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, killing thousands, flattening entire neighborhoods using white phosphorus, which burns the skin, illegal, by the way, under the Geneva Conventions, targeting schools, hospitals, journalists, funeral processions, but somehow only when Palestinians strike back does the conversation begin. Let's be honest, no occupation is peaceful, and no people will stay silent forever. If you want to look at the IRA in Ireland, you'll see that there. If you want to look at the ANC in South Africa against the apartheid, you'll see it there. These aren't new things that you need to be told and we need to understand. It's just because we don't know the history, very recent history. Resistance is not only a natural human response, it's the right that is enshrined in international human law. Blaming Hamas for the destruction while ignoring the decades of destruction inflicted by Israel is like blaming the slave for breaking his chains, but not the master who placed them. That's as simple as it is. What's truly perverse is that Israel's propaganda machine, backed by Western governments, complicit Western governments, now paints the occupier as the victim and the occupied as the aggressor. The tragedy is not that the violence erupted on October 7th. The tragedy is that it took Palestinians fighting back for the world to even start noticing. And now, even as Gaza is reduced to rubble, the world still dares to ask, well, why did they do this? The next myth. Criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. I think you pretty much know the response to this one. We don't need to spend time on this. But it's a conflation which is intellectually dishonest. It's academically corrupt. There's no legitimacy to that argument. Let's see. I want to pick some of the key ones. We'll come back to that one at the end. Okay, myth. Hamas uses human shields, which leads to civilian casualties. This is again one of Israel's most cynical talking points. By the way, we put together a list of myths and kind of responses to those myths. So I'm just going to be selecting from them. We're not going to get through all of them, but I want to kind of see the questions that you guys have sent as well. This is one of Israel's most cynical talking points. They use it to justify bombing of hospitals, schools, apartment blocks, refugee camps. But it collapses under some scrutiny. Investigations by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, especially after Israel's assault on Gaza in 2009 and 2014, found no credible evidence that Hamas has systematically used civilians as human shields. You just hear these human shields, human shields, human shields. Right? Like you hear beheaded babies, beheaded babies. These are just these tropes that you hear. What this narrative achieves, however, it gives Israel this cover to carry out indiscriminate, disproportionate, unlawful attacks. whilst blaming the victims for their own deaths. What's rarely acknowledged and almost never covered in Western media is that Israel has an extensive documented record of using Palestinians as human shields. Israeli soldiers have forced Palestinian civilians, including children, to walk ahead of them during raids, knocking on doors suspected of housing fighters or remain in buildings under fire. This practice has been condemned by Israeli courts. It's been documented in detail by Beit Salim, or by Beit Salam, breaking the silence, other rights groups. All of these other rights groups, they've talked about this. But Israel accuses others of crimes it repeatedly commits. And there's a well-known phrase when it comes to Israel, and it's completely true. Anybody who's kind of followed this a little bit, you'll know, every accusation is a confession. Every accusation that they level, it's a confession. Let's be clear, if Hamas had truly used human shields on the scale Israel claims, we'd have seen endless photographic and video evidence by now. Instead, we get recycled IDF talking points and cartoonish animations at press conferences. Meanwhile, actual footage shows entire residential neighborhoods flattened by Israeli airstrikes with not a single military target in sight. The human shields claim is not about protecting civilians. They don't care about civilians. It's about dehumanizing Palestinians so that any massacre can be excused. It's a propaganda tool that allows Israel to continue its siege and slaughter with Western complicity and without any consequence. Right? And so that's garbage. This is a complicated conflict that goes back thousands of years. Again, this is another claim. This is one of the most dishonest and lazy framings used to deflect attention from the ongoing crimes of the Israeli state. In reality, it's not complicated at all. This is about settler colonialism. This is about land theft. This is about military occupation. This is about the systematic dehumanization of a native population. It's not an ancient religious feud. It's nothing to do with religious feuds and these kind of arguments or disagreements. It's a modern political project of domination. Framing it as this centuries-old religious dispute, it's just a convenient distraction. It's to make the violence seem unsolvable and therefore unaccountable. But the oppression of Palestinians has clear modern origins. The ethnic cleansing of 1948, the military occupation of 1967, and the continued expansion of illegal settlements, all backed by Western governments. The same ancient hatred narrative is never applied when the Jewish community or the Jews, they are the victims of the violence. When anti-Semitic attacks occur, no one shrugs and says, it's complicated. They call it what it is, unjustifiable and wrong. But when Palestinians are bombed, starved, imprisoned, suddenly the West remembers how complex things are. That hypocrisy is not accidental. It's designed to paralyze action. And it's designed to suppress accountability. The truth is simple. One side is the colonizer, the other is the colonized. You'll see these arguments that I'm presenting, I'm just using the same arguments. I'm just framing them slightly differently because the arguments are rooted in that history. It's that one bit of history that we need to know about that will allow us to respond to everything. Right? It's this apartheid that's taking place. It's the war crimes that are taking place. It's the dispossession of the indigenous people. They're demanding freedom and dignity. What's really complex is the mental gymnastics required to defend Israel's crimes while it's pretending to care about human rights. And so the solution isn't complicated. In the occupation, follow international law and stop funding apartheid. Next, Hamas is a death cult that wants to wipe out all Jews. So Hamas is a death cult that wants to wipe out all Jews. Now again, I don't have to clarify this. We're all people of understanding. Hamas in UK and the US is a proscribed organization. To express support for a proscribed organization is an illegal act. We don't need to mention this. It's obvious, right? We're not sat here expressing support. But we're having academic discussions. We're having conversations that need to be had. Right? And we're going to even look at the deproscription of Hamas and kind of should Hamas be proscribed and what was the process of the proscription of Hamas, and is there a possibility to distinguish between the military arm of Hamas and the political arm of Hamas? These are conversations that need to be had. And so Hamas is a death cult that wants to wipe out all Jews is the myth. This accusation, again, is another manipulative trope that's used to delegitimize Palestinian resistance. It deliberately obscures the reality. It's a smoke screen. Right? That it makes it of a colonized people who are fighting for survival under one of the most violent and well-funded military occupations in the world. Look, Hamas's 2017 charter makes it explicitly clear. Hamas affirms, and I'm quoting the charter, Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. That's in their 2017 charter. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. The struggle is against settler colonialism. The struggle is against military occupation, not Judaism, not Jews. Look through Islamic history, it's never been the issue, has never been Jews. The issue is Zionism. The real threat of genocidal ideology is not in Hamas's charter, but in the openly stated goals of Israeli leaders. It's Israel, the occupier, the siege layer, the state that's dropping 2,000-pound bombs on residential neighborhoods. It's that state whose ministers routinely incite racial hatred and mass violence with impunity. The finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, he publicly called for the Palestinian town of Huwara to be wiped out. National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, a lifelong disciple of the terrorist Mir Khan, displayed a portrait of mass murderer Barak Goldstein in his home and has called for Palestinians to be shot on sight. These are currently in the ministerial offices of Israel. Former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked approvingly quoted calls for killing not just Palestinian fighters but their mothers, describing them as snake hatcheries. They are hatching snakes. Avigdor Lieberman, another senior figure, once called for beheading disloyal Arab citizens with an axe. If this was coming from the Hamas charter, you'd immediately say, look at the Hamas charter. This is coming from the Israeli government, the upper echelons of the Israeli government. These are not fringe extremists. These are cabinet ministers shaping state policy with international backing, by the way. Their genocidal rhetoric is not hypothetical. Oh, well, we can read into it like this. Let's assume what Hamas has said clearly what their objectives are. But let's assume that their objectives are this. But whereas the people who are saying it outright, it's not hypothetical, it's reflected in their actions too. From the mass bombings of civilians, destruction of homes, systematic starvation of Gaza's population, and yet it's Palestinians who are accused of harboring genocidal intent. Conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, it's not just dishonest, it's cowardly. It's a propaganda shield used to kind of silence criticism of a regime that's built on ethnic cleansing and racial supremacy. Racial supremacy. And this is, by the way, something that is never mentioned. If there's a Muslim who's an extremist who does something, it's very quick to say Muslim extremist. If there's a Christian who does something, Christian fundamentalist. If it's a Hindu who does something, there's Jewish extremism. That's what it is. Let's call it what it is. We're not saying there's a problem with Jews. We're saying that when it reaches that level of extremism, that's what it is. It's extremism within the Jewish community. And the reason you can say that from an academic perspective is because they're not quoting the Quran, they're quoting the biblical scriptures, they're quoting Amalek, they're talking these types of incidents where the entire community was killed, the animals were killed, the lands were burnt, and they're saying, and it's come from the mouth of Netanyahu, Amalek is what we're about here. That's coming from the mouth of the current Prime Minister of Israel, or the President of Israel, whichever one he is. And so to frame the Palestinians as bloodthirsty savages whilst turning a blind eye to the institutionalized brutality of the Israeli state, it's not just double standards, it's complicity. And again, remember, I have no interest in going down the route of causing religious problems. We're not about that. It's academic discussions we're having here. And this is where we need to understand that everything that is being said can be backed up by, credible sources. Next, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is the only democracy. This is one of the most shameless lies used to defend Israeli apartheid. Israel is not a democracy. It's a colonial regime that rules over 14 million people from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, half of whom are Palestinian. Over 5 million of those Palestinians live under Israeli military occupation siege, no right to vote, no civil rights, no protection under civilian law. They're controlled by a government that they didn't elect, under a system that they have no say in, a government that bombs them, imprisons them, denies them basic human rights. Even within the 1948 borders, where Israel boasts about Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens are treated as second class. They face systemic discrimination in land rights, education, housing, public services. The 2018 national state law made this racial hierarchy official. In Israel, there's a racial hierarchy that was made official in 2018 through the national state law, declaring that only Jews have the right to national self-determination. It's not a democracy. That's what you call an ethnocracy. Stop claiming that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's an ethnocracy. Again, it's not coming from me. I'm not interested in politics in the Middle East. But it gets worse. Not only is Israel an apartheid state, it's also deeply theocratic in nature. Religious courts, not civil ones, Religious courts control personal status laws like marriage, divorce and burial. There's no civil marriage in Israel. Only Orthodox Judaism is officially recognized. That's not a democracy. So they marginalize secular Jews, they marginalize non-Orthodox Jews, they marginalize Muslims, they marginalize Christians. All of these far-right religious parties like Shas, United Torah, Judaism, religious Zionism, they wield massive power in government. And they openly push for Jewish supremacy, the expulsion of Palestinians, Torah-based governments. Senior ministers in Netanyahu's government have publicly said that Jewish law should override democratic values. Why are we pretending that they are a democracy when the people within the cabinet are telling us? Why is it that we have to infer the Palestinians' actions, but when the Zionist entity tells us with its own mouth, we'll make excuses for them? So what kind of democracy is it when millions are ruled without rights, where religious law dominates civil life, and where non-Jews are structurally excluded from equal participation? The answer is simple: it's not a democracy. It's an apartheid, settler colonial ethnocracy, propped up by Western hypocrisy and increasingly being shaped by theocratic extremism. And so the real myth isn't that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. The real myth is that Israel is a democracy at all. And that's the real myth that has been debunked. A few others that I'm skipping past. Why don't Palestinians just move to the other 21 Arab countries? This isn't a question, it's a justification for ethnic cleansing. It implies that Palestinians are somehow interchangeable, that their homeland is disposable, that their identity is meaningless beyond a shared language. Is there not an identity beyond just the language? Are all the Arab states just one body that means? There's no other cultural differences, there's no other cultural significance, there's no other differences. It's that same colonial mindset that, the Arabs, they're all the same, the blacks, they're all the same, the Asians are all the same, these are all the same. It's that kind of colonial mindset that if you don't like being occupied, just leave. If you don't like the occupation, leave. Let's be clear, Palestinians are indigenous to historic Palestine. They are not Arabs from somewhere else. Many Palestinian families can trace their roots to specific towns, cities, and villages for centuries. They are the descendants of Canaanites, early Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Arab tribes that have lived, formed, built society on this land long before Zionism existed. Being Arab does not make them foreigners. That logic is like telling Irish people, move to Scotland because you're both Celtic. Or telling Mexicans to resettle in Argentina because you both speak Spanish. It's absurd, and let's call it what it is. It's racist. It's racist. The argument also exposes the hypocrisy of those who demand the world honor, the demand that the world honor Israel's right of return for Jews, even if their ancestors never lived in Palestine. They have a right to return. You can return to this land even if your ancestors didn't live, but the Palestinians, they don't have that right to return. And so, it entitles somebody from New York or Moscow to take land in Haifa or Hebron, but that a Palestinian who's born in exile has no claim to the village their grandparents were expelled from. That's ethnic supremacy. Right? And so Palestinians didn't leave voluntarily. They were driven out by massacres, forced flight and military terror during the Nakba. And then to tell them just to move on and accept someone else stealing their homeland is the equivalent of telling a robbery victim to be grateful that their thief owns 21 other houses. It's ajib. Anyway, next myth. Hamas uses hospitals, schools and civilian infrastructure as command centers. This claim is Israel's go-to excuse for bombing the absolute living daylights out of civilian infrastructure, and it's been systematically debunked again and again. Despite endless repetition in Western media, no credible evidence has been produced to justify this narrative. Look, there has to come a point where we develop the mindset of the boy who cried wolf. The Zionist entity has lied so many times that anything that they will say should be held to the highest levels of scrutiny. And by default, I would question anything that is said. The default should be questioning it. Just as that's used for, those figures on the dead, that's the Hamas figures. Doesn't matter, not interested, Hamas figures. Entirely the same is for the Zionist entity. The only difference is, by the way, none of the Hamas figures in terms of the dead or the deceased have ever been questioned by any authority over the last 20 plus years. It's never been questioned. So why would they be making it up now? But with Israel, it's the other way around. On October 27th, 2023, Israeli military spokesperson Daniel Hagari stood in front of the world and he claimed that Hamas was operating from 5 hospitals in Gaza in 2023, October 27th, which is 20 days after the 7th of October, using them as command centers and placing tunnels beneath them. This claim was used to justify the brutal siege, the raid and destruction of multiple hospitals, including Ash-Shifa, Gaza's largest medical facility. They were not just symbolic targets, there was lifelines. These were lifelines for a population under siege. They had newborn babies in incubators. And they didn't, we talk about beheading babies, there were gunshots in the incubators to make sure these incubators can't function again. Let's talk about beheaded babies. That's coming from Israel. That's coming from the Zionist entity. You know, the elderly, the wounded, the displaced. What followed was absolute carnage. Mass executions of civilians, bombing of hospital grounds, forced evacuation of patients, deliberately... If you guys have probably listened to some of the doctors and the harrowing accounts that they've mentioned when they come and talk about what it's like in Gaza, where they're in the middle of stairs, like on the kind of section where you're going up steps, and there's an operation taking place without anesthesia. There's a child with his brain like half hanging out. It's ajib, it's just different. And targeting ambulances and medical stuff. And what was the concrete evidence? Some weapons laid out next to MRI machines. Some tunnel entrances that went nowhere. Months later, a Washington Post investigation confirmed what Palestinians had said all along. There was no proof that these hospitals were being used as Hamas command centers. Just propaganda. It's too late now though, isn't it? The famous book that Umar al-Akkad has written, if you haven't got it, get it. And on the front of the cover it says, when there's no downside to calling a thing what it is, everybody will have been against it. You know, in 2023, as soon as everyone's saying apartheid, genocide, this, that, etc., nobody wants to. Now, watch everybody come out the woodwork and say, oh, it's genocide, it's terrible, it's absolutely shocking. We've been against it all along, you know, we've not justified it from the beginning. Because when the tide turns, everybody suddenly turns. Now it's convenient to be pro-Palestinian, isn't it? Now it's cool to be pro-Palestinian because you're on the right side of history. But everybody will have always been against it. Yeah, we're always against it. We never had any issues with it. That's how it always goes. The actual hypocrisy is staggering. While Israel accuses Hamas of hiding behind civilians, the Israeli army uses civilians as human shields. And we've talked about that. The tactics are clear. And so, those are some of the myths that I wanted to go through. I'm conscious that I've been going for 45 minutes. And so I want to kind of keep it within an hour. And so, let's take a look at some of the questions that you guys sent. And so let me refresh this. Okay, I'm going to read 3 of the questions that I found quite connected. Question number 1, were the actions by Hamas on the 7th of October permissible and within the parameters of Sharia? The same person then asked another question, what was the purpose of the 7th of October offensive? Another question, was it permissible for Hamas to begin October 7th war? Okay, let's start with them. Look, we're framing the questions wrong. And that's where we're going wrong. The entire debate is framed from a warped perspective. To answer these questions means that we're accepting the foundations on which these claims are based. So, to understand Hamas's role in all of this, we have to clarify a few points. Again, before I begin this next section, I will clarify. It's worth mentioning, Hamas is a proscribed organization, and so it is illegal in the UK and US to express support for any proscribed organization. And that's not what I'm planning to do here. Now let's start with Hamas. Hamas emerges in 1987, which is quite recent in the grand scheme of things. In our timeline, it doesn't start at 1987, but Hamas emerges in 1987, which is quite recent. Now Hamas is a mere representation of the resistance. The resistance has existed as early as the British Mandate from the 1920s. So resistance, or people resisting occupation, that's existed since the 1920s. And so Hamas the resistance existed for 70 years before even the emergence of Hamas. So let's not frame this as a Hamas discussion. If it wasn't Hamas, it would have been another group from the Palestinian people. If it wasn't another group, it would have been a third group. Hamas is merely a representation of that resistance. So now when people ask about the 7th of October, we have to ask ourselves, and they always say, why didn't they try an alternative approach? Why not diplomacy? Right? They should have done something like diplomacy. October 1997, I'm starting from the 1990s, I can go much further back. There's a 10-year truce offer. The Hamas leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, he offered Israel a 10-year truce on the condition of Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 borders. we're happy for you to go back to the 1967, not even 1940, not even the pre-1917, 1967 borders, will give you a 10-year truce. Israel rejected the offer. From the Palestinian perspective, this was a moment of serious outreach. And this is compromise. The Palestinian people have even tried to compromise. Forget diplomacy, they've tried to compromise with the Israeli entity. Hamas in March 2008 proposed, after the 2006 election victory, they wanted to transition to a less violent political path. Hamas was voted in, and they wanted to go down a less violent path. And so they said that let's have a tahdiyah, a lull, in kind of, like a ceasefire type thing. Israel rejected the approach. From Palestinian perspective, they wanted to move away. They wanted to move towards more political and diplomatic channels. Israel rejected it. April 2008, Hamas made an offer, which was brokered by Egypt, for a 6-month truce in Gaza, with potential extension to the West Bank, that let's also give a truce in the West Bank. Israel dismissed it outright. The Palestinian side presented this as a genuine opportunity to end the bloodshed that was taking place under the siege. Even the former US President Jimmy Carter, he reported that Hamas leaders were willing to accept a 2-state peace agreement with Israel. The Palestinian people have tried diplomacy. I mean, I even put together a document specifically on this because I thought that this was something that nobody was talking about. Let me see if I can. I've titled it "The Truth Behind Israeli Assassinations." I don't know if I should just read it. I'll just read it out to you. Again, you can find it on zidna.co.uk/negotiations, either negotiations or negotiation. So I'm just going to read sections of it. And so this is the kind of academic piece that I wrote. I'm going to begin with my premise and build from there. The premise is simple. For Israel, peace talks don't just fade away, they get assassinated. Israel's history reveals a chilling and consistent pattern. Whenever negotiations threaten to produce even the faintest flicker of peace, it resorts to cold-blooded assassinations. These killings are deliberate acts of sabotage designed to eliminate any pathway to peace, ensuring that occupation and endless conflict remains the only realities on the table. Pay attention now. In March 2004, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Hamas's spiritual founder, was incinerated by an Israeli missile in Gaza as he was being wheeled from Fajr prayers, a strike that also killed several bystanders. Why? He had just offered the possibility of a 10-year truce, an unprecedented concession, yet Israel crushed that prospect with raw firepower and ensured the conflict would continue. That act set the tone for decades of blood-soaked obstruction. 8 years later, in November 2012, Ahmad Jabari, Hamas's military chief, was killed in a targeted strike just hours after receiving a draft permanent truce agreement from Israeli mediator Gershon Baskin. It was a rare opportunity to institutionalize a lasting ceasefire. By murdering him, Israel sent the clearest message possible. It does not want peace, it wants perpetual occupation, and it will kill anyone, including those willing to compromise, to preserve its war machine. The cycle repeated in January 2024, when Israel struck Beirut to assassinate Saleh al-Aruri, Hamas's deputy political leader and a key figure in Qatari brokered ceasefire and hostage talks. His death instantly undermined delicate channels that could have secured the release of captives and eased Gaza's devastation. Then in July 2024, Israel assassinated Ismail Haniya in Tehran, the political chief of Hamas and its foremost lead negotiator. As a central figure in talks over ceasefires, hostage releases, and broader arrangements, his elimination was a deliberate act of sabotage, blowing up the table at which negotiations were being built. It was yet another attempt to extinguish the prospect of peace, proof that whenever diplomacy edges towards success, Israel prefers to assassinate the process rather than allow it to bear fruit. This pattern reached new depths of arrogance on 9th September 2025. We're talking, 2-3 months ago, when Israel bombed Doha, violating Qatari sovereignty to target Hamas's negotiation team as they deliberated over a United States proposal. The US got them on the table, and the US were brokering it in Qatar. The negotiators survived, but the strike forced Qatar to suspend its mediation role and exposed every guarantee of diplomatic safety as a lie. It was a direct assault not just on Hamas, but on the very concept of diplomacy. Before I wrap this up, I'm obviously writing and thinking, it's worth touching on the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. Rabin was the rare Israeli leader prepared to make tangible moves towards peace with the Palestinians. He was not killed by a foreign enemy, but by an Israeli extremist radicalized in an atmosphere of incitement. In July 1995, Netanyahu led a mock funeral procession featuring a coffin and a hangman's noose at an anti-Rabin rally where protesters chanted, "Death to Rabin." The crowds that once screamed "Death to Rabin" were egged on from platforms where figures like Netanyahu stood, and today similar rhetoric is amplified by leaders such as Ben-Gvir. Rabin's murder showed that peace within Israel itself is hunted down and eliminated, and that those who pursue compromise risk being silenced by their own. Finally, I remind you that Western powers have been directly informed and involved at every step. Washington continues to funnel weapons and provide diplomatic cover, ensuring assassinations are never scrutinized or investigated, but instead met with silence or even applause. Europe hides behind cowardly platitudes, mumbling about de-escalation or making hollow gestures of recognizing a Palestinian state, all while supplying arms to the very state that systematically sabotages peace. The so-called international order, built on UN charters, Geneva Conventions, and treaties to protect negotiators, stands exposed as hollow. And I'm finishing now, it's two paragraphs left. It's clear for all to see these assassinations are a deliberate policy to keep Palestinians stateless, to keep diplomacy dead, and to keep war perpetual. Israel plays the executioner, but it is Western money, Western arms, and Western vetoes that place the blade in its hand, that sharpen its edge, and wipe it clean when the killing is done. And so the next time that you hear Israel and the West celebrating the deaths of Hamas leaders, ask yourself what they are really celebrating. Because too often, it is applause for the death of diplomacy, the collapse of negotiations, and the extinguishing of any prospect of peace. And the next time you hear claims of freeing the hostages, cries of anti-Semitism, or other such platitudes from the settler colonial belligerent state of Israel, remember that these are hollow pretexts to mask and perpetuate genocide. Peace is not absent because Palestinians refuse it. Peace is absent because Israel murders it and the West picks up the tab. And so the point that whole article that I wrote there is to point out, and so I'm not going to go into any of the other ones, right? So that's one issue. No, they've tried diplomacy. Now, on the other side, let alone Israel, the Arab brethren didn't provide any diplomatic support or provide any leverage. As soon as Egypt signed the Camp David Accords in 1978, this gave Israel permanent legitimacy in the region, and it placed the Palestinians and the negotiations at a place of weakness. Even after Hamas won freely democratic elections in 2006, instead of defending the result, Arab regimes joined the Western boycott. Egypt under Mubarak closed the Rafah crossing, enforcing Israel's siege on Gaza and even destroying tunnels that provided food and medicine. Saudi Arabia and the UAE supported Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah's attempt to overthrow the elected Hamas government, fueling internal division. So diplomacy was shut down by Israel. The Palestinians were isolated and abandoned by the Arabs around them. So fine, why didn't they try and resist peacefully? They should have done protests. Are you insane? That's literally what they did. In the famous Great March of Return in 2018, tens of thousands of Palestinians held peaceful protests. What were they asking for? Simple, two things. Number one, end the 11 years of siege we've lived under and we've been subjugated by, and that's torn our lives apart. And number two, allow us to return to our villages and homes. Not under new legislation. We don't want new laws, but under the rights that are owed to us and still owed to them under the UN Resolution 194. The United Nations General Assembly, I'll read to you the Resolution 194, word for word, it's very small. Refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return and for loss of or damage to property, which under principles of international law or equity should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible. This is the issue I have with the UN. This is the issue I have with these bodies. These are living in ivory towers speaking of these theoretical things. It has no authority. It has no way of legislating these things. For months, every Friday, Palestinians gathered near the fence, separating Gaza from the rest of their homeland. They held flags, they chanted, they prayed, they called for dignity and freedom. It was civil, it was a political rally. No military intervention, nothing. What's the Zionist response? Israeli forces positioned hundreds of snipers along the border under explicit orders to use live ammunition. According to the UN, United Nations Human Rights Council Commission of the inquiry 2019, 183 Palestinians were killed in these protests. Among them 35 children, 3 paramedics, 2 journalists. 6,000 plus were wounded by live ammunition. They were left permanently disabled. They were targeting not to kill, but they were targeting to maim these individuals. The UN concluded that Israeli forces have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. No Israeli soldiers or civilians were killed during these protests. What do you want them to do? Turn to the international community? Turn to the Arabs to protest? All of these things you've done. You tell me if you've come together to do this. The international community is silent. The Arab world is silent. We're being wiped out of existence. What options remain? You want more diplomacy? You expect more peaceful protests? This event became the clearest symbol. The 7th of October became the clearest symbol of Palestinian desperation. And so, even if you look at this the specific incident that I'm referring to, the kind of when they were protesting every Friday, etc., eyewitness videos showed medics in fluorescent vests, unarmed youths waving flags, and even children being shot hundreds of meters from the fence. Self-defense. Why is there bullet holes in children? How many bullets were shot into Hind Rajab? Anybody know? When you go home today, just go on YouTube and type in the audio of Hind Rajab's final moments. You'll cry listening to Hind Rajab's final moments. Little girl, plus 200 bullets that were placed inside of her. Any self-defense? We're talking. You have the audacity to say beheadings. You have the audacity to say this and that. And just, I swear, wallahi, just go, just put in Hind Rajab audio. And you'll break down. It's one of those videos that you have bookmarked. When your heart feels hard, you just listen to that and you just weep. And if you've got children, it's heart-wrenching. And the way she calls out for her mother in that final moments, the way she's just she doesn't know what's going on. What have these children done? And so they've tried everything. They've tried diplomacy. They've even tried compromise. They've tried non-violent resistance. Everyone turns a blind eye. So what next? 2023. It was the most violent year on settler incursions in the West Bank. Bombings before okay, that's important. It was the most violent year on settler incursions on West Bank before the 7th of October 2023. Before the 7th of October, it was the most violent. There were even bombings that had taken place before October 7th in Gaza. Masjid al-Aqsa had been stormed multiple times. They've attempted so many different things. Okay, well, let's ask so all of this has been attempted. All of these different things. I even have an article that I have saved somewhere here. If you go on Save the Children, the actual the organization, they had an article published 18th September 2023. This is before the 7th of October. 2023 marks the deadliest year on record for children in the occupied West Bank. I'm reading the article, it's a 5-minute read. Right? And it talks about 2023, the deadliest year on record. It wasn't the 7th of October that did all of this. This was happening before the 7th of October. It was the worst year for children. We're not even talking about everybody else. At what point do you say they should have done diplomacy? At what point do you say they should have gone to the table and done debates and this and that, etc.? And it's because we're just ignorant of the situation. We have no idea of what's taking place, and we can sit here and have the audacity to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. And so, khair, with that being said, let's just finish this off. So, Hamas has attempted all of the means. The Palestinian people have attempted all of the means. So what remains? Well, let's ask the UN Charter. Let's ask the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. Let's ask the UNGA Resolution 3070, 3246, 3743. Let's ask the 4th Geneva Convention, which I talked to you guys. And the words, all of them unequivocally, explicitly, they recognize the legitimacy of the struggle of peoples under colonial and foreign domination, including the Palestinian people, by all available means, including armed struggle. Most people, by the way, they know this. And I remind you, what people forget to mention is that under international law, and I mentioned this, Israel as an occupying power does not possess the right to invoke self-defense against the people it occupies. An occupier cannot claim self-defense in response to resistance from the population whose land it occupies. because its very presence is unlawful. Numerous UN resolutions and legal scholars have held that the right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter applies only to states defending against external armed attack, not to an occupying power suppressing resistance within the occupied territory. And so, khair, with all that being said, on one hand diplomacy fails, on the other hand resistance is enshrined in international law. Let's come to October 7th. Tufan al-Aqsa is the name of the military operation that aimed to break the siege of Gaza. It was aimed to strike Israeli military targets. I'm quoting from the actual documents that we have. Striking Israeli military targets, capturing Israeli soldiers to secure a large-scale prisoner exchange, all presented as a response to decades of occupation, repeated violations at Al-Aqsa, settler violence, and the humanitarian collapse in Gaza. Hamas leaders, the likes of Ismail Haniya, Muhammad Daif, and the movement's media office, they described the raid as intended to force an end to the status quo. They were trying to bring the end, not to start something new. This is the only way they saw that was going to happen, to gain leverage for prisoners and draw attention to the Palestinian cause. Outside analysts also say, by the way, that there was behind the scenes imminent kind of regional normalization taking place. So between the Arab states and the Zionist entity with Israel, there was this kind of normalization taking place. And that was extremely concerning. There's also credible reports that Hamas believed Israel was preparing a major campaign. In the documentary by Al Jazeera, Izzuddin al-Haddad, he's a member of the Qassam Military Council, he stated that they had obtained intelligence from Israel indicating that a surprise attack was imminent. The attack would involve targeting all resistance factions through airstrikes, followed by a devastating ground invasion. And so Tufan al-Aqsa was to be Hamas's, by Hamas's own declarations, a military act of resistance. According to early Israeli estimates, approximately 1,124 people were killed on October 7th. Though these figures have fluctuated over time as investigations have evolved, the official count has never been independently verified. And even within Israel, there has been significant uncertainty over how many of the dead were combatants, armed settlers, civilians, as well as how many were killed by Israeli fire rather than by Palestinian fighters. Several reports, including eyewitness testimonies from Israeli survivors and soldiers, point to instances where Israeli Apache helicopters, tanks, and other military units opened fire indiscriminately once the clashes began. Now, if you've never heard of this, you need to hear of this. It's called the Hannibal Directive. The Hannibal Directive authorizes lethal force to prevent the capture of Israelis. It's within the kind of the instituted documents of the Israeli government. The Hannibal Directive is something. If there is a risk that our own civilians are going to be taken, and they are going to be taken as prisoners, kill everybody. Kill everybody. We don't want anybody to have negotiation power over us. We'd rather sacrifice these people. Can you imagine in the West if they said that? If somebody was to take over, let's say, one of the shopping centers, and somebody's taken over that shopping center, now they're going to use these civilians, and they're going to use these innocent people as bargaining power, bargaining chips. And the British government says, bomb the entire building. Remove their bargaining chips. We don't care. That's what the Hannibal Directive is. Some accounts even describe cars and shelters being struck by missiles and tank fire. That's absolutely not coming from this group of individuals who have broken in, these kind of Hamas fighters that have broken in. And so it led to explosions in various different locations, such as the Nova Music Festival site. And so it seems what's being said by the people who are studying this, journalists, Israeli fire seems to have caused or amplified civilian deaths. So the events on the ground became far more chaotic than planned. And there's several uncontrollable factors that contributed to this. Look, Hamas acknowledged that some civilians were unintentionally harmed. It maintains still till today its objectives targeted military facilities and personnel, which is enshrined in the international law, and that third-party groups and spontaneous civilian participation contributed to the disorder. This is important. They broke in. There are also other factions other than Hamas, third-party groups. When they saw this kind of siege, they're breaking in, they rallied and they broke in as well. They weren't part of Hamas. They were part of fringe groups. It could be extremist groups, it could be different groups. And they broke in as well to try and cause some damage. So that took place. Along with that, obviously, spontaneous civilian participation, that contributed to the disorder. Independent verification of these claims remains impossible. Israel has categorically refused to permit any international or independent investigation into the events of that day. They block forensic access, restrict journalists, and they centralize all narratives through their military spokespersons. Anywhere else in the world, in every modern conflict, an occupying power, unwilling to open its conduct to scrutiny, it tells you more about guilt than security. So the truth of October 7th, including how many of those deaths were caused by Palestinian factions and how many by Israeli fire, remains deliberately obscured. What's certain, however, is that Israel's military doctrine and suppression of transparency, they allow Gaza to remain in the siege. So in response to the questions on Hamas specifically, leave aside Sharia law. International law recognizes the right of an occupied people to resist foreign domination and apartheid rule. By that standard, the objectives of Operation Tufan al-Aqsa, the striking military targets, the breaking the siege, securing prisoners of exchange, is morally defensible or legally defensible under international law. Those goals align with the principle of self-determination, the lawful right of resistance affirmed by multiple UN resolutions and international conventions. And naturally, within the confusion of battle, the collapse of Israeli command structures and the involvement of uncoordinated third groups and civilians, it led to acts that did not reflect the original intent of the operation. Those deviations, they are absolutely tragic, but they must be understood within the chaos of sudden confrontation. And I remind you, when you have, again, Zionist shills like Piers Morgan who are coming out telling us about his moral quandary of self-defense, I remind you for the third time, the occupying power has no legal right to claim self-defense against resistance. Israel's use of self-defense argument is therefore, it's a distortion of international law. And so when you ask me for my academic analysis of October 7th, without any emotion, purely from an academic perspective, I will say to you, it was inevitable. And I don't know what other options remain on the table. This is what you do in academia, by the way. You sit down and you say, what other options were available? You know, millions of dollars and millions of pounds are invested into war preparation. And millions of pounds are invested into war games, not the games that you play on your PlayStation. You have academics who will come together. You'll have somebody who does strategy of finance, strategy of this, war, this, military C. And they come together in a room and they put out this map, this huge map of the world. And now they'll play out different scenarios across the world. So China versus Taiwan. Let's say China was to now occupy Taiwan. Let's play the game. So they would play and they would do military strategies. Millions of pounds are put into this to the extent that I remember in the war against the Japanese, one of the kind of war generals, one of the kind of admirals, he said, we had prepared for this entire war. We had seen every possibility and every possible scenario except for the kamikaze bombings. That's the one thing we were unprepared for. But we prepared for every other scenario. Millions of pounds are invested into this. Millions of pounds are invested into this. And so if you're asking, and that's what academic analysts have to do. They have to sit down and say, what else is going to happen? And this was inevitable. If you ask any analyst to sit down and say, this is what they've gone through, this is what they're going through, this is the current status quo, they will tell you themselves, it's a disaster waiting to happen. I don't care what the name of the group is, I don't care what this is, I don't care what... Somebody is going to do something, and it's going to explode, and it's going to be a big issue. Anybody could have seen that. And so, when you ask me the situation there, 97% of the water undrinkable, there's no relief. They count the calories that are going in to make sure that it's a deficient amount going in. The electricity and power infrastructure is entirely fragile, right? Bombs and things like this constantly. International airport runway in Gaza was destroyed years prior. They didn't allow any kind of air movement or anything of that nature. And so with all of these things considered, there's not really much of an option. And so if you ask me in international law, was it justified? I think from an international law perspective, they have actually said that there was justification. The issue is obviously with the civilian deaths or the civilian targeting. And of course, we all say, unequivocally, that civilian deaths on all sides is an issue for us. You understand? Khair. Shall we continue with the questions you guys have sent, or shall we wrap it up there? I'll take that as a wrap it up there. So the questions you guys missed out on is A Palestinian friend of mine said, "May Allah curse the leaders of Hamas for launching an offensive that killed every member of his family who had nothing to do with it. They were living fairly decent lives in Gaza prior to all this. Are these comments justified or not?" So I spoke to a Palestinian to get that response. But yeah, you guys, what did Maulana Abu Hassan Nadwi say in regard to the difference in criteria set by Allah for protection of Masjid al-Haram and the Prophet ﷺ mosque as opposed to the criteria by Allah? I'm not sure. I haven't read his book on Palestine. I've heard people say that he says that Mecca and Medina will be preserved on the basis of Allah and Palestine will be preserved on the basis of the state of the believers. I don't know. I've never come across that statement of his in a book. I've heard it quoted by a lot of people, but I don't know what to make of it until I've seen it myself. He has an Urdu book on Palestine, which is a really good one. With the Palestine protests and flag flying, have we not fueled right-wing racism and made it worse for us in the UK? Very different subject, very different topic on the right-wing racism. I've commented on this recently, but I guess we're done for questions for today, so we'll wrap it up there, inshallah. Just kind of the last comment. Just the last comment that I will make is because I spoke to the person who asked the question about the Palestinian people, they kind of have this issue with Hamas, etc., etc. So I spoke to a Palestinian friend of mine who is on the ground, and his closing comment in the conversation I had with him today was, "Our dead are martyrs and our survivors are victorious." And the thing I will present to you is there's a nuance here. Every struggle for liberation has a heavy price, right? Take Libya, for example. When Umar Mukhtar, he led the Sanusi resistance against Italian occupation in the early 20th century. It's not very far off. You should know about this. The world barely flinched as Italy kills between 250,000 and 300,000 Libyans, nearly 1/3 of the entire population. Villages were completely kind of destroyed. Families, they were being starved in concentration camps in the desert. Right? Thousands were executed. Yet today, that same Umar Mukhtar is honored, not because of the losses, but for the dignity he restored to his people. Freedom always demands a price. And the same reality faces Gaza. Right? Support for the resistance there remains strong. Support for the resistance even in places like the US and places like this is strong. Polls that have been done of under 40s, people who are under the age of 40 in the US, right wing, I think more than 50% are anti-Israel now. And the polling is showing. There was a question that asked about social media and using social media. I don't think we've realized the war that we're facing on the right wing front. You know, look, I'll keep it simple. You go to your neighbor, and your neighbor or the person who's, Mohammed, I don't have an issue with you. The issue I have is with the people who are coming on the boats. Ask her, have you ever seen any of the people coming on the boats? No. Where did you get the boats information from? Social media. I don't have an issue with you, Mohammed. I have an issue with the people who are, causing this or grooming gangs. Have you met any individuals from the grooming gangs? No. Where does that come from? Social media. We haven't even realized that the war that we are fighting is on social media. It's a social media war. And everybody else realizes it but us. Who just purchased TikTok? Who just put the money in for thingy to purchase TikTok and Instagram and some of these things? Zionist groups are putting money. Who controls the AIPAC lobby in America? In our country, you have friends of Israel, conservative friends of Israel, Labour friends of Israel. I have a friend who's in the offices, and he says to me, when October 7th took place, for a month, I saw Jewish members of the public, members of the Jewish community, leaving at 7 a.m. after having meetings with the Prime Minister at the time. Every single day for a month. We're fighting a different war, and the rest of it's a social media war. It's a political war. It's this, it's that. There's so many fronts that we're just kind of completely oblivious of. Now people say that these are run by, certain kind of organizations, this and that. I still don't think there's an issue in using them. I think that the benefit of using them is greater than the harms. But yeah, in all the other respects, boycotting and this and that, absolutely, we should be doing it to whatever degree we can. I don't think we're having the conversation of boycotting 2 years on. I don't think we need to even bother with that conversation. But I think there's a lot of realities on the ground that we have completely missed. It's a social media war. The right-wing movement, a lot of it is a social media war. The reason we're losing, Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, whatever you want to call him, this guy, Elon Musk, all of these kind of guys, they're fueling this. They're fueling this. And that's the war that's being waged at the moment. And as Masajid, I think it's time to develop your social media profile, not for the Muslim community, for the non-Muslim community. You know, creating conversation and having difficult conversations. Your talk at the Visit My Mosque Day is going to do nothing. Because the guys who are coming into the Visit My Mosque Day, let's be honest, these are people who already know about Islam. These are people who are somewhat sympathetic to Islam. If you have the audacity, if you have people trained, bring somebody from Reform, local Reform MP, or whatever, the council or whatever, and bring him and sit him down. Watch how you fill the masjid with the right wing and Muslims, and you have a conversation. And if you are able to dismantle those arguments and those tropes and have real conversations, you'll create much more than you think that you're doing. And a couple of these clips that go on social media, our views on grooming gangs and our views on this, that'll make the difference, a world of a difference, that, you know, our other engagement will not. Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali al-Nadwi mentioned this. He mentioned this when he came to Dewsbury. He's come to the UK twice before he passed away. He was a giant of a scholar. When he went to the Haramain, when he went to Mecca, the Shaybi family gave him the key and said, Ta'ali Abul Hassan, you open the door of the Kaaba. Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali al-Nadwi is that scholar from the Indian subcontinent, from our heritage. And Sheikh Abul Hassan Ali al-Nadwi, when he came to Dewsbury, he said, don't be beguiled and don't be fooled by your mosques. Spain had better mosques than you do. The Spanish had greater scholars than you have. But overnight things changed for them. And when the flames of extremism and the right wing, they burn, everything that you hold dear will disappear. You have to appreciate that we're living within a host community. What da'wah are we doing to them? You know, like what is why should they come to Islam? Like in London just today, there was one of the marches or something like that. The Muslims attended. You know how the Muslims attended? They attended in balaclavas and they attended in this. Like, we're not part of gangs. Show your face, attend as a normal human being and protest. Say what you need to say. Attend, if you're not media trained, don't say anything. But if you're media trained, say what you need to say. Like, it's simple as that. Like, why are we suddenly, like, we've just completely, we don't understand the war that we are facing on the front that we are facing it on. And so we're focused on those little things that tick boxes and make it look like we're doing something. And that's why many mosques in London now, they're hiring beyond imams as well. They're hiring individuals. And there should be like frank conversations, because this is obviously our mosque. This is my local masjid, really. No matter what happens, this will remain my local masjid. How is there not CPD for imams? You tell me, every one of you who are professionals and you're going into workplaces, you have constant professional development. Who's investing in the imams? Your imams haven't been media trained, and now you expect them to be able to respond. You can't respond to these things. If I was to ask you some of the difficult questions on Palestine, you'd crumble. And so what, you expect the imams to know this? You've got to invest in your people. You've got to invest in the people who are leading your communities. Send them for media training, pay for that. If that means you have to develop a £5,000 CPD training for your imams on an annual basis, you have to do that. But you know, you've got to put into them, you've got to invest into the software of your mosque. The hardware is brilliant. It's always nice and warm in here. The carpets are the softest, copyrighted from what I hear. It's brilliant. But the software needs investment. If you buy a mobile phone which has all the best hardware, yeah, fine, it's brilliant, it looks good. As soon as I use it, it's terrible. But I've invested nothing into my software. I've invested nothing into the people that are supposed to be raising the next generation. Me being in London, and I come back to Preston, and I'm thinking to myself, there's like 20 streets here that need to be focused on. That's nothing. That's nothing. 20 streets, like, if you guys as a community get together, 20 streets can be like easily doable. And by the way, the guys from the US, when Imam Tom Fakini, he came, he said to us, UK, it's nothing, it's tiny. If you give us 10 years in the UK, we'll have this under locks. US is the challenge. So everybody sees obviously, like the fish analogy, big fish, small fish, big pond, all this kind of stuff. But we have to understand the fronts that we are facing, the kind of the battles. And so that right-wing conversation, look, I don't think protests are going to dissuade the people, white indigenous people, if you want to put it like that. If you phrase it like this, if you say to them, 40 million of your taxpayer pounds was spent in arming Israel, that should have been spent on you. Have you never questioned your government on that? You should be at that protest questioning, why is my money that I'm giving in taxes going to defend another state? Why is Tommy Robinson, this amazing patriot, sat having a podcast conversation with a Zionist in Israel, and he says, there's a special place in hell for you Christians. And Tommy just sits there smiling and laughing and carrying on. Where's your patriotism gone? What is this? It's a grift. He's making money off it. And so I think sometimes these frank conversations are important, and I think sometimes we have to realize exactly what's going on. We're focused on the wrong things, and we're focused on kind of the things that are we need to develop a strong identity as believers. We need to have conviction in ourselves. We have to have some kind of training. Look, I'll be honest with you, right? So a lot of people say, and I'm saying this, wallahi, I'm saying this sincerely. Yeah? People have said, oh, you speak on Palestine and other people don't. You know why I can speak on Palestine? Because I can spend hours and hours preparing for this material and I'm paid for it. That's the reality. I'm paid to spend hours and hours preparing for this material. It takes time to put this stuff together. Imams don't have that time, they don't get that pay. Unless you're willing to say to them, take a week off and prepare this. Sometimes it'll take me 2-3 weeks of just constant day in, day out of preparing material. That's why I can sit here, I can have a full script prepared. I know that if I say something, it's been checked, and we have a legal team that vets our work as well, puts it to the front of the line. I'll say to them, I need this checked, I need this vetted within 6 hours, and they'll do it for us. That's what allows me to do that. That's what I couldn't do if I was here. And that's the difference that I'm saying. That's what maybe we need to be investing in. If we don't invest in that quality, we're not going to get that quality for our children and for ourselves. And so these are some thoughts, again, like you only say these things to your family. You don't go into somebody else's house and tell them how to set up their house. This is home. As much as you guys will try to push me out, but it's so that's why I mentioned some of these. And hopefully it was beneficial. Hopefully you guys, I find it beneficial to prepare this material as well. But these are the more long-term conversations that you need to think about. I know Sheikh Ashraf, he's always talking about these similar things. But I see that kind of issue more when I come from London and I come here, and when I'm talking to local imams and I'm saying to them, how's the masjids doing? How's the turnout? How's this? How's that? And we all know, we see it dying. We see it kind of, it's drying up. And, it's going to become just Jum'ahs, it's just going to become Eids, it's just going to become celebrity people that turn up. The tafsirs and the hadith classes that take place locally, just dry, just devoid of attendance. And there's something that has to be done fundamentally there. And maybe that's training, maybe that's this, maybe that's that, whatever, it's investment. But software needs to be invested in. If the hardware looks all funny, but the software works, people will come. The Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no hardware, no walls, no roofs, nothing. But the software was so good that when Thumama ibn Uthal, he's bought, an enemy of Islam, as a prisoner. There's nowhere to place him, there's no prisons, they tie him to the pillar. For 3 days he's tied to the pillar, he's fed, he's given the ability to be taken to use the loo, and then he's brought back, and he's kept there. Nobody speaks to him. The Prophet ﷺ comes 3 times out to him, and he says, how are you, Thumama? And he says, in tun'im ala shakir. If you do good with me, my people will show favor to you. Taqtul da damin. But if you kill me, you kill somebody of worth, and my people will come after you. That's it. The Prophet says nothing else. 3 days. The Prophet ﷺ comes and he says, release him. Thumama ibn Uthal goes, he makes a ghusl, he comes back. He says, there was no face that was more hated to me than your face. There was no religion that was more hated to me than your religion. O Muhammad, there's no face that is more beloved than your face to me. And there's no religion that is more beloved than your religion. And he accepts Islam. But don't just get excited at the story and move on. Ask yourself, what was it? It was the vibes of the masjid. It was what he's seeing of the teaching. It's the masjid is living. The masjid has a life to it. The masjid has a soul to it. That masjid environment was sufficient to transform him. Right? Not just the Ramadan environment, but the masjid, normal masjid vibe. It's what it should be. The masjid is used 24/7. There's something taking place. There's something happening. There's this, there's that, there's that. That is what brought people to Islam. No hardware, software. Software. The masjid of the Prophet ﷺ was entirely software. And so our priorities have somewhat shifted. And it's difficult for us to kind of have these conversations, but these are the conversations I think that are needed. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Now look here, if somebody comes to me and asks me a question now, I would have said I'll knock you out, but it's on site, all right? Because I gave you guys the option to go through questions, and every single one of you shouted out, no, we don't want any more questions. I heard all of you. So inshallah we'll wrap it up there. We had 1 hour 30 minutes on my recorder, so that's a good time to wrap it up inshallah. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.